I thought psychiatrists wanted to be seen as doctors.
You're right. That's why they had to make their manual look much more scientific.
Which it wasn't. So what did they do then?
Well, they decided the DSM's next edition was going to be completely different. It was a decision that would change psychiatry forever.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living now essentially had to be redefined, and they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So hence we have DSM-III, which is the third edition, which is published in 1980.
Under Spitzer, psychiatrists editing the DSM-III threw out Freudian psychology and decreed that from now on, psychiatry's diagnoses were purely biological.
So they finally became scientific.
No, actually, not at all. In fact, the political bickering over what disorders to put in and what to leave out of the DSM-III was even more ridiculous. Here's what one psychiatrist had to say about it.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
And this is what another member of the DSM decision-making panel said.
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Sounds like they had a diagnostic manual that looked more scientific but had no more science in it than before.
Meanwhile, the number of mental disorders in the DSM-III had ballooned to 259. But to sell the idea that psychiatry was a true medical science, they had to spin it with a really impressive scientific-sounding theory.
But with DSM-III from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalisation of psychiatry. And the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
Whoa, chemical what?
Chemical imbalance theory. It was first suggested in 1965 to try to explain how depression might be caused by an imbalance of certain brain chemicals.
I'd like to hear this.
Joseph Schildkraut theorized that because psychiatric drugs alter the levels of some of these chemicals, then mental illness must be caused by too much or too little of them.
Isn't that backwards?
It sure is. It's a little like saying that because aspirin stops a headache, that headaches are caused by the deficiency of aspirin.
I see what you mean.
But it was just convincing enough to give psychiatry and the DSM-III the superficial aura of science. As Robert Spitzer put it,
psychiatry felt now, gee, we're more scientific, we're part of medicine.
So it worked.
Yes, and ever since then, psychiatrists and the pharmaceutical industry have relentlessly promoted this chemical imbalance theory both to the medical field and the public.
If you're one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame.
Prestige is thought to work by affecting the levels of two chemicals in the brain.
It works to correct chemical imbalances in the brain, which may be related to symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
Cymbalta works on serotonin and norepinephrine.
Hundreds of thousands of patients have been prescribed Abilify. Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Call your doctor.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Prestige is a key in helping to treat my depression. Ask your doctor about Prestige.
You come to my office. and I say to you, well, you describe what's going on in your life and your symptoms, and I say, well, it's clear to me that you've got a chemical imbalance and we're going to write you a prescription for this. The truth of the matter is there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
There's no test out there that they can depend on that tells you you have a chemical imbalance.
There's actually, in fact, dozens of studies showing that there isn't any measurable imbalance. So psychiatrists will explain to patients all the time, this is just like diabetes. In diabetes, you have low insulin, we have to readjust the insulin level. In depression, you have low serotonin, we have to readjust the serotonin level. But actually, we have already proven that there's nothing wrong with serotonin levels. It's completely a myth, disproven by our own evidence.
I had a psychiatrist. He said that, in his professional opinion, this child had ADHD, a chemical imbalance of the brain. And when he was questioned on the witness stand as an expert witness for the state, he was asked if they had done an MRI. He said no. He was questioned if they had done a CAT scan. He said no. He was asked if they had done any bodily fluid check known to medical science to prove that this child had a chemical imbalance of the brain. He says no. And when he was asked how he arrived at this ADHD diagnosis, a chemical imbalance of the brain, it came down to that he had counseled and observed this child for 2 hours, and half of the time was observing. How do you arrive at a diagnosis of a chemical imbalance of the brain by talking to a child and observing them for 2 hours? You don't, okay? It's pure guesswork.
Wow, is this for real?
See for yourself. Here's what happened when a person with a hidden camera went to several different psychiatrists asking to be tested for a mental illness.
So are there any scientific tests?
Not that I'm prepared to do this time.
So you getting that I have adjustment, what is it again?
Adjustment disorder, mixed emotional thinking. It just means situational stress.
Right,
it's a formal diagnosis.
But I'm saying, just where do you get that from?
I take you at face value.
In terms of diagnosis, there's no way that I can x-ray or project or allow.
So it's very hard to have anything to measure. Because whatever's going wrong, it's happening in there, and we just can't go in and open up somebody's skull and scoop something out to measure.
Right now, we don't have an x-ray or a blood test. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is not correct.
The diagnosis is for insurance, and I'm not really trying to think too much in terms of diagnosis. I don't really see that as my main job here to make a diagnosis, except to give something to the insurance that's reasonably accurate.
But we don't even really know what's going wrong in the brain. So all the things that we found were found by accident.
I'm stunned. Psychiatric diagnosis is based purely on individual opinion.
No matter what they do, they're wrong. Britain's BBC even did a show on this where 10 volunteers, 5 considered normal, and 5 previously diagnosed as mentally ill, were observed by 3 well-known mental health experts, who were then asked to determine who was who.
Oh boy.
Watch this.
We think that it's likely that you've had a history of bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
You're wrong.
We've come to the conclusion that at some time you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder.
You're wrong.
We were wondering whether at some point in your life maybe that you had suffered from a significant psychiatric problem of some kind or other.
No.
Not at all?
You are wrong.
All right, okay.
3 wrong diagnoses in a row. After a whole week of observation, the panel have identified just 2 out of 5 disorders.
So much for science.
You got that right.